Greetings, salutations. I'm Dexter from Research Stripped, and we interrupt our regularly scheduled human trafficking video for this. The National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. The Biden administration just released this December of 2021, hot off the press. It is 66 pages, but we will just be covering the highlights and also with a little colored commentary sprinkled throughout. Starts off with your introduction letter from President Joe Biden. First, they talk about the Palmero Protocol, which is a UN initiative that the U.S. signed on to. And then they talk about the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which President Biden says that he proudly supported as a U.S. Senator. Interestingly, though, that the law passed 95-0. Weird flex. Moving on, they talk about in 2000 that there were foundational pillars enacted in the TVPA. Those were actually the prevention, the protection, and prosecution. This administration decided to add another one, partnership. Just remember, that's the fourth pillar, partnership. Keep that in the back of your brain. And then they go into gender and race equity. I do not like the term equity. I prefer equality because equity has some negative connotations. There is actually a YouTube video link down below where you could find out the difference between equity and inequality going on, and they talk about all the minorities. We'll come back to that again later on. And then they talk about COVID-19. Of course they do, because they are the government, and they always have to mention COVID-19 in any report they have done in the past 2 years. And they talk about COVID-19 made it clear that we had to secure our supply chains. So I don't know what this has to do with human trafficking. Going down later on, you got his signature. Then we go into the table of contents. Remember what I said about the 4 pillars? It's supposed to be pillar 1 is prevention, protection, prosecution. Then it's supposed to be partnerships. But instead, they have it as cross-cutting approaches and institutional effectiveness. Lots of big words there that mean very little. And we'll go through that pillar later on. Acronyms. As we move on to the introduction, they bring up the trafficking in persons statement along with human trafficking, right? Because the government has three phrases that they use interchangeably: human trafficking, trafficking in persons, and modern slavery. I like this because down on the bottom here, they say human trafficking is also referred to as a form of modern slavery, that the government recognizes that there is no equivalent of the U.S. today, and human trafficking as to the experience of U.S. back in the day when they had actual institutionalized slavery. I like that little bit of statement there. Now we get into some numbers that they're starting to state to justify various actions. They stated in 2020, 11,193 situations, I like the word situations, of human trafficking were identified throughout the United States via the human trafficking hotline. And then you go to this report here, the Trafficking in Persons report, which is a whopping 646 pages long. Go to under the section of United States of America. Right there, under prevention, and this is the reference, 11,193. And what they had was they received a whole bunch of things. They found 11,193 potential human trafficking victims, never verified. And out of those, then 88,701 were actually referred to somewhere else. I just don't like how they use these numbers justifications as potential instead of actuals. Talk about human trafficking, strip clubs, because they always have to mention strip clubs. And if you are more interested in what I talk about strip clubs, see my previous video on trafficking victims regarding strip clubs and how it is used in the reports. They're using the same source as I did in that video. This is a little thing regarding differences between human trafficking and human smuggling. Human smuggling is just clandestine crossing the border. Human trafficking is trafficking those victims using force, fraud, or coercion. They don't have to cross international lines, but there is overlap between human trafficking and human smuggling, because smuggling leaves smuggled in people rather vulnerable to trafficking. Talk about the characteristics of human trafficking. Who's the victim? We go into individuals particularly vulnerable. We got the people, kids in the welfare system or have been to juvie, runaway and homeless youth, unaccompanied children, undocumented, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous people of North America, LGBTQI+ individuals, migrant laborers, persons with disabilities, individuals with substance use disorder, girls, women are notably more vulnerable. And they also talk about boys and men. They just basically said the entire population of the U.S. I don't know why they keep on mentioning all these, and you'll see it throughout, sprinkled throughout this document of all these listed out. It's like everyone's vulnerable. There's also a dearth of data nationwide related to the people of color and for everyone else too. Because one of the biggest challenges facing law enforcement was actually to identify human trafficking victims. This is kind of interesting. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that the majority of people prosecuted for trafficking are for sex trafficking, but Health and Human Services assistants are all about 70% were labor trafficking, and only 15% were sex trafficking, 11% were both. And for children, it's about the same percentages of 69% victims being labor trafficking and 25% were for sex trafficking. Yeah, I just find it's kind of unusual how the numbers are flip-flopped between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. They use the term exploited, which I really don't like. Exploitation to me seems more of a civil affair as far as an owner exploiting his workers, whereas an owner having human trafficking involvement, that's an actual illegal crime for criminal. Who are the traffickers? They talk about trafficking networks, and I believe that they are using the term that I covered previously for a network or criminal organization of being more than 3 or more people involved. So it could be 3 people only, and then when big scary word of transnational criminal organizations. I know that there are some scary transnational criminal organizations out there, but this can actually just mean a couple people on one side of the border, a couple people on the other side of the border, and trafficking victims from there. Just saying. They talk about various transnationals organizations that they stopped, terrorist organization, and then you also have everyone who's bad boys on the international scope. They use the word facilitate, which I don't like them using because it is overly broad in my belief. So they talk about how they get the victims, force, fraud, or coercion to get them to get into the trafficking aspect of it all. They also talk about human traffickers using technology. We all use technology now, so it's kind of like saying that human traffickers use a phone back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. To that, you have law enforcement trying to get the latest tools and technology, and they're talking about anonymous browsing as a danger, but I believe anonymous browsing is a freedom that law enforcement should not infringe upon. Corrupt government officials enable the traffickers to get visas to come over and all stuff like that. I always think that all these corrupt government officials are south of the border, supposedly, but also I think it's a little naive for us to think that we do not have any corrupt government officials. They do a little snippet about illicit massage businesses and that the owners a lot of the times don't use their real name or they use a pseudonym for their business licenses. I don't know why the federal government is pushing this. It really is that's a state and local issue regarding business licenses and how strict they are about that. They talk about the importation of goods, talking about this report, and this report is 104 pages long in total, but most of it is just a list of the countries. What I don't like about this report is that they don't go into companies, they just say in general these products. Cotton is rather broad. Tobacco, really prefer if they did certain companies, but I guess that'd be more difficult to update. Moving back onto the strategic plan. In the introduction still, they're talking about strengthening the efforts. And then they talk about all the laws that they use for justification of why they're putting this strategic plan and how they're putting it together. All these highlighted ones are kind of funny. Enforcing, you see through here, trafficking, indentured child labor. This is the task force on missing and murder American Indians and Native Alaskans. Combating human trafficking. These two, which are just kind of weird to use this as justification, which is the White House gender policy and also advancing race equity. Again, there's that word equity. Please watch that video down below, link down below. Really has nothing to do with trafficking. And then go into the President Task Force, Interagency Task Force, where they talk about their strategic plans. Here they are listed. I go through all these in a previous video. If you want to read through these as I slowly scroll down. So they're pretty broad in general, typical of government, right? So those are the 10, and just kind of like 3 pillars. They just didn't like the 10, so they had to go down and they have to list their own little additional 5 statements, which are actually still in this strategic up there. Leverage financial authorities, prevent their access to U.S. So this is all FinCEN stuff. Financial security, again, financial. And that's the Forced Labor International. And then support law enforcement investigations that lead to accountability and justice. Isn't that what the entire TVPA is for? We're moving on into the first pillar, prevention. And they talk about the prevention of human trafficking. This also including lack of information about high-risk populations, which is, as mentioned earlier, just about everyone in the U.S., environment, circumstances, and the difficulty connecting with the most vulnerable populations, insufficient understanding and access to scientifically rigorous data. You'll find this a lot throughout. There's not a whole lot of data out there that is actually scientifically proven stuff. There's a lot of surveys and other things that give generalities, but there's nothing really specific to better inform which strategies are most effective. There is no real rating on effectiveness. There's numbers at the end, but they really don't say which one's the best one. So the principal one is an enhanced outreach and education, which I'm perfectly fine. Enhanced community coordinated response to human trafficking. And again, they go through the American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and other indigenous people of North America. Oh, did I forget one? Yes. Implement Health and Human Services for Children's and Families Trafficking Prevention Action Plan. Tried to look this up, and I could not really find anything about it online. And this is I thought it was kind of funny, as they're talking about the effectiveness of action plans previously. And they talk about DoD. I wonder how many of the 7,000 dependents or students enrolled in DoD schools are actually been victimized each year in human trafficking. I think this is a very protected class. Most of the ones in DoD schools are overseas on base. Okay. They talk about demand reduction, which is how they're charging criminals and stopping that going on. Or the Johns and the people who accept the services of human trafficking. Then they go, again, like I mentioned previously, limited information on the range of initiatives or how effective they are. And they give you someone's going to do a working group to conduct a literature review regarding all the demand reduction and how it works. Kind of in the wishy-washy aspect you'll notice throughout also is subject to the availability of funding. There's no real funding going on or earmark for all this. Strengthen efforts to identify, prevent, and human trafficking, from supply chains and ventures. This is, again, the international aspect of it all. Require select agencies, senior accountable officer for anti-trafficking stuff. Okay, no problem there. Kind of like this. Engaging various industries on the use of forced labor and supply chains. And they're talking about how to do it all, and they're saying presentations and webinars. Okay, that's like low effort. This one's actually kind of interesting. The Priority Action Plan 1.3.3. And identify the DoD contractors. And I'm thinking of a lot of it will be aimed at the TCNs, third country nationals that work on bases overseas. I've noticed when I was deployed out over there, a lot of not copacetic practices that goes on with the TCNs and the local nationals. Okay, this is how to do it. Forced labor, again, that report that I mentioned earlier. And it goes through here, still going over all this, how to identify. Okay, moving on to Principle 1.5 for the visa program. Ongoing reports from workers and advocates highlight the urgent need to examine ways in which how the visa program is broken. And I'm all for all this. Monitor and support implementations. And it goes into several of the various visa types, which I'll bring up shortly. And then this is kind of interesting because currently the visa categories, there are a bunch. There's like B1, B2s, H1, H2s, J1s. various types of visas. I won't get into that, but which non-native immigrants can come to the U.S. It's interesting because a lot of those, or they don't have the same rules in place for each of the visas, such as prohibiting worker-paid recruitment fees and fees imposed as a condition for employment, and providing the contracts, okay, not all employment-based non-immigrant visa categories include these protections, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, change all that up. Identify enhancements, yes, get that fixed. And here is what I talked about, the J1s, which are student exchanges. There is actually been issues with people coming over here on J1 status to work as a student work program in the U.S., but it turned out that the employers were just using it to get them to do certain interesting things, we'll say. Moving on to the second pillar, protection. They start off with talking about special visa programs for victims of human trafficking. It's called the Continued Presence Program, and they are able to get T visas or U visas, which actually allows them to get a whole bunch of federal benefits. Again, improve identification of the victims. And then you regard another equitable, which makes me nauseous, equitable, nauseous. And they talk about research shows that ingrained racial and gendered bias and stereotypes lead to disparate assumptions of who should have access to the protections and services. This is from actually a special interest group. Yeah, streamline and update, validate, get it all set up. Okay, and this is kind of interesting. I went to a conference on human trafficking, and they talked about the screening forms to identify at-risk minors, and I asked for data to support how many at-risk were actually trafficked, and no one can answer me, which is, I find, very interesting. And again, the softening availability of appropriations. Nothing set to fight it. Okay, here they talk about ICE and how they're screening. And funny thing is minors suspected of experiencing human trafficking will be referred to Health and Human Services. And then they talk about, again, how child welfare, which is state-ran, and juvenile justice system is also state-ran, are particularly vulnerable, along with the rest of the population. And then the funny thing is that the Health and Human Services will ensure that they are not placed in a situation where they are vulnerable. Yet, if they place them in a situation, they automatically turn vulnerable because of the child welfare system, which they have to fall under. Circular logic, I think, is in play right here. Federal long-term foster care, that's just funding. There are no, that I know of, actual national foster care programs. Establish protocols to incorporate promising practices. Interviewing law enforcement. And then they go into screening by law enforcement, doing a lit review, and then within a year of the lit review, they will have standardized screening processes across the various law enforcement agencies. Federal trained law enforcement, okay, yes, that's fine. Training is always a good thing. This is also kind of nice, tailored to context where possible and culturally relevant. Again, a trafficked victim in Atlanta is going to be completely different than a trafficked victim from Tijuana, or from New York, or from North Dakota. If they can actually turn it into tailor-made versus one-size-fits-all, it'd be a great thing. Next one is public awareness materials focused on victim identification, although it is difficult to identify victims even by the professionals. And that's within 1 year, but no funding allocated. This is kind of like this, but it does lead to a couple issues. It's to safeguard victims of human trafficking from being inappropriately incarcerated, fined, or otherwise penalized for doing unlawful acts while they are being trafficked. But then you fall into the trafficked victim becoming an enabler, kind of moving up the hierarchy. And where do you draw that line? Federal training policies reviewed with principles victims should not be inappropriately, okay, always, yes. Provide human trafficking victims protection from removal. That's what we're talking about with the immigration. Fix up the immigration before you can even touch this. And then I kind of like this also. So if you were inappropriately arrested for, let's say, prostitution, then you could go through vacatur and expungement. This word right here, which I will not attempt to pronounce again, is basically voiding that conviction. So then they would, even if it was under a felony, if they get voided and expunged from the records, then they're not a felon anymore, and then they get full access to everything. And then encourage, again, no money allocated. And we are talking about particularly vulnerable population being in the child welfare system. And they say, okay, but we have to make sure that law enforcement refers minors to the child welfare system instead of arresting them, which, I don't know, being trafficked or arrested. Improve access to immigration benefits and options. That's, again, visa program. Modernize immigration program systems. And again, nothing appropriated, subject to availability of appropriations. But what's kind of sad is that they're still under a paper-based system. And then again, immigration system. You have to fix up the immunizations system before you can actually fix all this stuff. But one interesting thing to note is that there is a cap of 5,000 visas per year for that special type of the U or T immigration status. They've only been doing about 200 a year. Improve assistance encountered. Okay. Increase victim assistance personnel to the extent of funds available. Again, nothing earmarked. And why would the IRS be dealing with victims? Any increase in IRS staffing or power, I really don't like. Moving on to Seek Financial. Then they talk about, according to some organizations, again, this is from non-government organizations with not real whole lot of hard numbers to go by. And then victim restitution is only in the minority of the cases. Okay, that's fine. Identify and seizing the assets of traffickers as soon as possible during the investigation. So they have not been proven guilty or anything. It's just during the investigation. And as mentioned previously, investigations can take a long time, especially if you are found to be not guilty. That usually takes multiple years. So I think that is going to become an abuse of power. Anything that asset forfeiture to the government, I really don't like. And then they talk about prosecutors and judges. That's basically educate your own people. Create comprehensive, again, train your judges and prosecutors. Offer and then connect victims to increase short-term and long-term stability. Mental health and other health care, yes, great. Okay, access to shelters and safe housing. This is going to have to be, the campaign will address victims' criminal records, but hopefully if they fix and get void expungement from the actual victims, then this would just go away. And again, increase access to employment. It talks about victims leaving incarceration, again, if they are voided or expunged, and this would go away. And then they go into Health and Human Services will adapt resources for a 2-generation whole family approach, which I'm really not a fan of. Priority 2.6.4, increase access to education. And they're talking about getting academic scholarships for victims. I'm sorry, I'm just not into that. Why would the government need to pay for post-secondary education? It makes no sense. Remember, this is taxpayer money. Taxpayer funded. What I do agree with is if a trafficking victim needs basic education as far as financial literacy programs, teach skills related to budgeting, opening bank accounts, and such on, then I'm all for that. But doing academic scholarships, not so much. Okay, increase access to the system broadly. That's just getting more information out there for them. Moving on to Pillar 3, which is prosecution. If you're one of the rare individuals that actually saw my 17-minute video about the prosecution and who the violators tend to be, congrats, and I'm sorry. Also, you would realize that the race, nationality, and culture tends to be the same among the victims and the traffickers. So it goes into these, and throwing in some scary terms for me, potentially culpable co-conspirators, including the facilitators who benefit financially. That is scary as far as that could be abused by the government. Then you have something that some victims might not even identify as crime victims. Again, I don't like this term of broad range. Build strategies to combat labor trafficking, which is prosecuted infrequently, which I completely agree with. And they should focus a lot on labor trafficking. Okay. Improve coordination, that's fine. And then they talk about building on, or consider building on, the AdKey initiative, which I discussed on a previous video, which are highly effective in combating human trafficking, more of the sex trafficking than the labor trafficking, and they are highly successful. I just don't like that they're saying consider building on. They are actually in phase 3 right now. The previous administration was talking about continuing on to stage 4, but then he got voted out. Okay, consider expanding U.S.-Mexico bilateral assistance, except mentioned earlier about the corrupt government officials. And then you also have the enhanced collaborative model task forces to assist, which is kind of like how the ACT team is. Seek to establish federally funded human trafficking task forces that are sustainable, but again, nothing is earmarked. Federally funded means taxpayer funded. This is actually a pretty good idea, that the task forces, kind of like how the ACT teams are based upon federal districts, they recommend, or they talk about doing it at least one task force per state, and then going on into developing the protocol for human trafficking cases that will not be criminally prosecuted on the federal level. So basically, it's deferring it to the state level or local level. And a lot of times when that happens, the trafficking charge gets reduced to a lesser crime. Okay, build capacity, talking about advanced training, prosecutions related to child sex trafficking at the local levels. And then again, Department of Justice will consider, and nothing allocated there. Enhanced capabilities to locate children. This is more of the prevention aspect of it, don't you think? Enhanced capabilities to locate children who are missing, including those who have run away from foster care and are vulnerable to human trafficking, which is, again, the entire population, particularly those in foster care. This action should actually be under the protection or prevention aspect, not the prosecution, because who are you prosecuting? The social media ads, again. Develop improved technology for human trafficking interdiction, technical barriers, talking about your internet companies, voluntary reporting stuff, and the National Advisory Committee on Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth. I did a DuckDuckGo or Google search on this, and I did not find the actual organization, the .gov aspect, which is kind of weird. A bunch of orgs were out there talking about it, but nothing from the government. And again, they complain. Many cases, law enforcement officials are unable to access data due to general privacy and security measures. Enhanced focus on investigating, prosecuting on demand, and other, again, facilitators. And this is a scary example. Facilitators, such as hotel owners who knowingly profit from sex trafficking, how do they get to know? I mean, if there's a connection, fine. But if you're just a hotel owner and human trafficking is involved in one of your rooms, I don't know, that just muddies the water and grays out who's actually culpable in a lot of the instances, especially when you have difficulty finding the victims. And then, again, they talk about like this hotel owner having their assets forfeited and used for restitution. That is just waiting to be abused. And civil forfeiture actions, again, waiting to be abused. And then enhanced reporting requirements. So there are mandatory reporters, physicians, teachers, nurses, police that are mandatory reporters. The general public is usually not considered mandatory reporters, but although some states have statutes that can make you liable if you fail to report. I think I covered that a little bit in the Tampa story. So that's just kind of, again, a little bit of power overreach, I believe. FinCEN is from the Treasury Department, and they're forensic accountants who go through financial entities to make sure that nothing sketchy is going on. But again, I don't like anything that says, in quotes, special measures, primary monitoring concerns, not proof, just a concern, and they could block that for 180 days. Okay, they're talking about proposed legislation to facilitate revocation of passports is if Americans go overseas to get their rocks off. Increase efforts to investigate and prosecute forced labor. Like I said, that is underutilized. And hopefully they say that successful prosecution of forced labor, while resource intensive, are likely to have significant deterrent effect, especially probably financially. Increased coordination and strategic engagement in investigating and prosecuting forced labor. Again, forced labor, yes. And that's the end of Pillar 3. Moving on to Pillar 4, which in Biden's introduction was partnerships, but this is cross-cutting approaches and institutional effectiveness. Again, a lot of buzzwords that don't mean a whole lot. It actually divides into two different things. Is bringing in the intelligence agencies into the trafficking organizations instead of just relying on the FBI, as they're talking about the actual CIA and other secret squirrels. And of course, they say we really don't know a whole bunch about it because first, improving is understanding the nature of the threat. It's kind of sad that after 20 years, they don't know the real nature of the threats. Again, intelligence, which means your secret squirrels. Research gaps, better serve vulnerable populations, which is the entire population. Like I said, all these here. Most at-risk industries, I would like to see a list of those. Probably ag and your massage parlors, and of course we're going to throw strip clubs in there just because. But They also talk about identify effective interventions to combat forced labor versus just doing it. Again, here's your vulnerable populations, which is everyone. Information sharing, whole government information approach, and data holdings. And again, we bring in secret squirrels. And this is all secret squirrel stuff. Secret squirrel. Keep on going. And then they go into incorporating survivor input, which there's already a Human Council, United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which, yes, have their input, but also rely more on facts and individual statements, as anecdotal evidence is not true evidence. Again, survivor input. All right, they talk about now into external partnerships. Again, human trafficking facilitators, not traffickers. Targeted information assessments will include precise typologies, types, indicators, and regionally specific information and methodologies of traffickers. Again, regularly provide information to the local governments. They really don't say time, just say regularly. So that could be once a year, once every 5, as long as it's regular. And here they bring on the 5-country ministerial, which is the US, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia. All their secret squirrels all interact and share the same sources of information. And then this one's interesting to maritime domain and seafood supply chain. So they're complaining that U.S. ships, Coast Guard, Navy cannot interdict in possible labor exploitation on ships that are not American. They talk about international air travel restrictions, tip operations, or hot tip. Moving on to Principle 4.5, continuously evaluate the authorities and resources for government contracting. Moving on to Principle 4.5, they talk about to evaluate how the resources are used. Unfortunately, with most government spending, it tends to be you don't decrease any of the spending, you just add on spending to a different program. Explore opportunities for legislative proposals. And priority action 4.5.2, conduct an assessment of the U.S. government's allocation of existing resources, which is great, but what they should do is remove the bottom half, the bottom 50% of the least effective interventions, and then start from scratch. But of course they won't do that. They'll just keep on piling more and more. And then of course you have to do the inclusion thing, inclusive, racial justice, and equity. Again, there's equity. Systemic racism. Now, this is the government talking, so they're saying, yes, we are racist, and racial justice and equity, again, based approach. And again, most of the people who are trafficked by people of the same race, nationality, culture as the victim. And that is the end. Let me know if you have any thoughts on this. All the publications that I used in this video are linked down below. Please like, subscribe, give me $10,000 and what have you. And with that, goodbye.